guys! As you can see, I'm not in my usual reading corner, and that's because we are moving to a new place. And even though most of my books are safely put away in the boxes, I thought moving is not a good enough of a reason to not talk about books. So today I want to talk with you about the one and only novel written by Irish poet and playwright Oscar Wilde. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a literary classic, which can be defined as a Gothic and philosophical novel. It was first published as a novella in the 1890s in Lippincott's Monthly Magazine. It is worth mentioning that before the novella was first published, fearing that the story was indecent, the editor of the magazine had deleted about 500 words from the novella without Oscar Wilde's knowledge. Most of the changes made were of passages that in one way or another alluded to homosexuality. However, these 500 words were not enough. After reading the novella, British audience felt very offended by what Oscar Wilde had written and believed that The Picture of Dorian Gray was breaking the laws of public morality. Oscar Wilde, while publicly defending himself and his work from such allegations, made multiple changes to the most controversial parts of the story in preparations of releasing the novella as a book. The longer and revised version of The Picture of Dorian Gray was then released in 1891. Despite being received in such a controversial manner, the novel survived the test of time and is now well known as a literary classic. As of now, The Picture of Dorian Gray has been adapted more than 50 times to films, TV, plays and musicals, and other literature works. Most well-known big screen adaptations being movies released in 1945 and 2009. Besides the actual adaptations of Oscar Wilde novels, the idea of what Dorian Gray symbolizes is known and understood even by the people who are not familiar with the novel itself. Nowadays, we even have defined a cultural and social phenomenon called Dorian Gray syndrome to explain the psychological condition of people who are extremely prideful of their personal appearance and a borderline obsessed when it comes to dealing with the aging process of their bodies. Anyhow, today we met up to talk about the book itself and not the cultural influences that have arisen from the said novel. So I guess we should proceed on doing just that. As per usual, we will start this video with a short synopsis, then continue to a non-spoiler review and wrap up this video with the spoilers. If you haven't read the book yet, then do not worry, I will let you know when the spoilers begin. The Picture of Dorian Gray begins with a conversation between Lord Henry Wotton, a charming yet egocentric and opinionated man, and a well-known sensitive artist, Basil Hallward. Basil is in the process of painting yet another portrait of his newest muse, Dorian Gray. From the conversation between Lord Henry and Basil, we get to know that up until now, Basil has been painting Dorian only as an ancient Greek hero or other mythological figures. The portrait that Basil is currently working on is his first try of painting Dorian as he is. And while Basil is unhappy with the result, as he believes that the portrait reveals too much of his own personal feelings, Lord Henry thinks that the portrait is a masterpiece and desperately wants to meet Dorian Gray in person. Basil is not a fan of the idea as he fears that Lord Henry might corrupt young, innocent Dorian. Now, the thing that you must understand about Lord Henry is his hedonistic worldview. Lord Henry, as a truly spoiled upper-class man of the Victorian era, believes that all of human behavior is determined by the need to increase one's pleasure and to decrease one's pain. And while hedonism as a life philosophy is not inherently bad, we see Lord Henry making the mistake of relying too much on the idea of pursuing only short-term gratification without any regard for consequences. Moreover, he is a strong believer that the only thing in life worth pursuing is beauty. So once he finally gets a chance to meet Dorian Gray, Lord Henry quickly plants the seeds in young Dorian's head in regards to Dorian's beauty and age. Henry manages quickly to upset Dorian by making him feel that his beauty and his young age are the only things that are of any value. and that unfortunately for Dorian, he will grow old and unattractive sooner rather than later. Dorian turns his hurt and his anger towards the portrait that will never change, never get old, and will always be a reminder to Dorian of what he once was. In an act of desperation, he pledges his soul, asking in return to the portrait to carry his burden of age and infamy, while he himself would stay forever young. Alright, so let's get some things right out of the way. Is this book filled with characters who are spoiled, self-indulgent, misogynistic, and despicable? Yes. But I'm also in love with this book. I was about 14 years old when I read The Picture of Dorian Gray for the first time, and all I could remember about the novel is that the story itself left a lifelong impression on my teenage brains. If someone would have asked me back in the day why I loved the book so much, I don't think that I would be able to actually answer the question. But oh my, did I love it! So after more than a decade since my first introduction to Oscar Wilde, I have decided to give it another try and read it again. Weirdly enough, the book was not exactly what I remembered it to be. In my mind, Dorian Gray was a naive, innocent guy who got involved with a bad crowd, aka the big baddie Lord Henry, obviously, which consequently turned his life into a series of unfortunate events that spoiled his character and ruined his soul. Also, in my mind, the story has taken much more time on describing the events and the slowness with which the picture of Dorian Gray turned into the monstrosity that became the undoing of Dorian. I guess for that I can blame the movie adaptations I watched after reading the book for the first time, and the fact that the Dorian Gray has long become an identity that is not attached solely to the work of Oscar Wilde. Dorian Gray and his picture is a legend, a cautionary tale of vanity gone wrong. As I have touched upon it in the introduction, even people who do not know this book have heard of Dorian Gray and the painting that never ages and shows the corruption of one's soul. However, now, after I have read this book again, I have noticed that that's not really the case. Surprisingly enough, the picture itself only really comes into play after maybe about 40% of the book. And even then, the story doesn't linger on it for too long. So if you have watched a movie adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray and thought that it would be great to read a terrifying book about a man who sold his soul, don't. This is not a horror novel, nor it's a novel packed with action. However, if you're looking for a short read which will leave a huge impact on you, and which dwells on topics that are still eerily relevant nowadays, then you should most definitely give this novel a try. In my eyes, Oscar Wilde is a true wonder. He's a talented wordsmith who gave us a truly original story. A story that is interesting and well-rounded and that leaves just enough room for every reader to perceive it in their unique way. And I guess what I found the most fascinating is that Oscar Wilde, a man who lived in the time where he and his work was greatly judged for perceived indecency, gave us a story that doesn't attempt to drive home any actual moral message. Instead, he simply invites us, the readers, to an open discussion. Alright, on that note, we will proceed to a spoiler review, where we can talk a little bit more freely about the characters and the events that happen in The Picture of Dorian Gray. So if you haven't read the book yet, but are planning to do so, now it's the time for you to turn off this video. When talking about his novel, Oscar Wilde said that he sees Dorian as Faust, a protagonist of a German legend, a man who is highly successful yet dissatisfied with his life, which leads him to making a pact with the devil at a crossroads, exchanging his soul for unlimited knowledge and worldly pleasures. Pretty straightforward and understandable comparison. The author also said that he sees Lord Henry as a modernized reincarnation of Devil, who seduces Dorian to sin. However, if we are looking at this work by the standards of the 21st century, Dorian doesn't really feel like an innocent guy who's being led astray by an evil force. Not to me, at least. Yes, Lord Henry and his unconventional lifestyle played a big role when it came to the way Dorian saw life. However, straight from the get-go, Dorian wasn't that nice of a guy. Already during his first appearance in the book, he seems to be charming, yet spoiled and vain. One of the biggest moments that set Dorian to the different path wasn't even influenced by Lord Henry. Dorian himself chose to be incredibly cruel towards Sybil, for very shallow reasons. As I have mentioned before, since there was a long gap between when I have read this book for the first time and then for the second, in my mind I had this idea that Lord Henry is directly responsible for Dorian and Sybil's breakup, which consequently then influenced Sybil's death. However, while having a demeaning attitude towards the actress, Lord Henry only suggests that they all go see Sybil act in a play, after Dorian confesses how crazy in love he is. It's Dorian himself who breaks up with Sybil in an incredibly cruel manner, simply because she decided to sabotage her own performance. He was the one who rushed to confess his feelings for Sybil without realizing that he loves not her but the woman she plays on the stage. He's the one who decided to propose to her without even knowing her. He himself is the one who got so embarrassed over her performance in front of his friends that he himself decided to break young girl's heart and drive her to suicide. And while Lord Henry was the one who introduced Dorian to his life philosophy, Dorian himself made the decisions that kicked off the rotting of his soul. If anything, I would argue that it's not Lord Henry who turned Dorian into an evil man, but the curse itself. The curse gave him a free pass to behave the way he wanted to behave, gave Dorian a life without any actual consequences. And yes, Lord Henry was the reason that pushed young and naive Dorian to act rash and sell his soul. But it's not like Henry himself knew that selling the soul is an actual possibility. And no, I'm not trying to excuse Lord Henry either. He is a morally rotten person, especially by today's standards. He is shallow, manipulative, and incredibly degrading towards women or anyone from a lower social class than he is. And yet, he is all bark no bite. Even in the novel, it's stated that Lord Henry speaks immorally but does no wrong. He lives a rather quiet life and is a highly respected man in London society. He attends social events yet doesn't indulge in sordid behavior. Lord Henry is full of these radical theories about seeking pleasure and living without consequences, but he spouts those ideas exactly because they are radical. He enjoys the shock value of his words, as he enjoys seeing how his words can influence others. It's Dorian who makes the proclamation that he would sell his soul for youth, Dorian who pushed Sybil to suicide, and Dorian who kills Basil. And therefore, I can't claim Lord Henry to be an actually malicious character. He might be the one to nudge Dorian, but it's always Dorian who makes a choice. Consequently, reading this book again showed me that this story is not really about the innocent young man who lost his soul because of the influence of the devil incarnate. I think that Oscar Wilde wrote this story to show his cynicism and criticism of the upper class society of his time. He wanted to show every one of the main characters in some kind of negative light. Basil comes off weak, a pushover who lacks confidence in himself and his art. Lord Henry is narcissistic and bored of his life that doesn't provide him with any challenge. And Dorian is the epitome of shallowness. None of the main characters ever had to encounter true hardship due to being influential, wealthy white men appreciated by society, and yet none of them know what to do with the influence and power they hold. Even worse, they are so bored of it that they let this power corrupt them. But that's just my opinion. What about yours?